The dust cloud rising from the wagon wheels could be seen for miles across the Montana prairie, and Grace Jensen knew without looking that her brother Daniel was coming to collect what he thought was owed to him. She stood in the doorway of their small, dilapidated cabin near Wood River, her hands trembling as she gripped the worn wooden frame, watching the wagon approach with a sense of dread that had become all too familiar over the past 3 years since their parents had died. Daniel had changed after that terrible winter of 1881, when fever had taken both their mother and father within days of each other, leaving Grace at 18 and Daniel at 25 to fend for themselves. But where Grace had tried to maintain some dignity and honor in their struggle, Daniel had turned to drink, gambling, and worse. "Get your things together," Daniel called out before he had even fully stopped the wagon. His face was flushed, whether from whiskey or anger or both, Grace could not tell. "We are going into town." "What for?" Grace asked, though she already felt the cold fingers of fear wrapping around her heart. Daniel had been acting strangely for the past week, ever since he had lost heavily at cards to a group of men passing through Wood River. He had been muttering about solutions and opportunities, and Grace had learned to fear those words from his lips. "That is none of your concern," Daniel said, climbing down from the wagon with unsteady movements. "Just do as I say for once without arguing." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to stand her ground and demand answers, but she knew from experience that Daniel's temper had grown unpredictable. The bruise on her arm from 2 weeks ago still ached when she moved it wrong. She went back inside the cabin and gathered her shawl, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The ride into Wood River took nearly an hour, and Daniel said nothing the entire way, his jaw set in that stubborn line that Grace had come to recognize as him having made up his mind about something foolish. The town was small but bustling, serving the ranchers and homesteaders scattered across the surrounding territory. They passed the general store, the church, and the saloon before Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the land office. "Wait here," he said curtly, jumping down and disappearing inside. Grace sat in the wagon, her stomach churning with anxiety. She watched the people moving along the wooden boardwalks, going about their daily business, and wondered what it must be like to live a normal life without the constant worry that had plagued her for so long. A woman about her age walked by with a basket of vegetables, smiling at a man who tipped his hat to her, and Grace felt a pang of longing so sharp it nearly took her breath away. Daniel emerged from the land office with another man, someone Grace did not recognize. They spoke in low voices, the stranger glancing at Grace several times with an expression she could not quite read. Then Daniel was climbing back onto the wagon, and they were moving again, this time toward the edge of town where the larger properties began. "Daniel, what is happening?" Grace finally asked, unable to keep silent any longer. "Where are we going?" "To fix my problems," Daniel said. "And yours too, if you think about it. You will have a roof over your head and food in your belly, more than I can provide." The words sent ice through Grace's veins. "What have you done?" "What I had to do," Daniel said, and there was something defensive in his tone, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "The Langford Ranch. Keith Langford needs a wife, and he is willing to pay well for one. You should be grateful." Grace could not breathe, could not think. The world seemed to tilt around her. "You are selling me." "Your own sister." "Do not be so dramatic," Daniel said, but he would not meet her eyes. "It is an arrangement, a business transaction. Langford is a good rancher, wealthy. You will be better off than you ever would be with me." "You cannot do this." Grace's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "This is insane, Daniel. You cannot just sell a person like livestock." "I can do what I need to do to survive," Daniel said, his own voice hardening. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to be responsible for you after Ma and Pa died? I have debts, Grace. Debts that will get me killed if I do not pay them. Langford's money will clear those debts and give me a fresh start somewhere else. So you are selling me and running away, Grace said, and she was proud that her voice did not break, though tears were burning in her eyes. How much am I worth to you, Daniel? What is the price of your sister's freedom? $500, Daniel said quietly, and Grace wanted to scream at the shame in his voice, wanted to tell him that if he felt shame he should not be doing this, but she knew it would do no good. Daniel had always been weak, always taken the easy path, and this was just another example of him choosing himself over doing what was right. The Langford ranch came into view, and Grace was struck by the size of it despite her turmoil. The main house was a solid 2-story structure, well maintained with fresh paint and a wide front porch. Beyond it stretched barns and corrals, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It was clear that Keith Langford was indeed successful, but that did nothing to ease the terror and anger roiling in Grace's chest. A man emerged from the house as the wagon approached, and Grace got her first look at the person her brother had sold her to. Keith Langford was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His face was weathered from the sun but handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and deep-set eyes that were watching the approaching wagon with an expression Grace could not quite read. He wore simple work clothes, a chambray shirt and worn denim pants, and there was a certain weariness about him that went beyond physical tiredness. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop, and Keith Langford walked forward slowly, his eyes moving from Daniel to Grace and staying there. Grace lifted her chin, refusing to look away or show the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. If this man thought he was getting a meek, broken woman, he was going to be sorely mistaken. Langford, Daniel said, his voice falsely jovial. I brought her as promised. This is my sister, Grace. Get down from the wagon, please, Keith said, and his voice was deep and quiet, directed at Grace rather than Daniel. It was not harsh, but it was not exactly gentle either. Grace hesitated, then climbed down, her legs unsteady after the long ride and the shock of what was happening. Keith Langford studied her for a long moment, and Grace stared back, determined not to be the first to look away. She saw something flicker in his eyes, some emotion she could not name, before he turned his attention back to Daniel. The money is inside, Keith said. Come with me. They went into the house, and Grace found herself standing in a spacious front room with simple but sturdy furniture. Everything was neat and clean but had an impersonal quality, as if the person who lived here did not quite know how to make a house into a home. Keith went to a desk in the corner and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out bills with methodical precision. $500 as agreed, he said, holding the money out to Daniel. Count it if you want. Daniel took the money with hands that shook slightly, and he did count it twice before tucking it into his jacket. He glanced at Grace, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. You have what you wanted, Grace said, her voice cold. You can leave now. Daniel flinched at her tone, but he nodded. Grace, just go, Grace said. You have made your choice. Now live with it. Daniel turned and walked out, and Grace heard the wagon wheels a moment later, rolling away and taking the last remnant of her old life with them. She stood in the middle of Keith Langford's house, alone with a stranger who had just purchased her like a piece of property, and felt a strange numbness settle over her. Keith Langford did not say anything for a long moment. He put the desk drawer back in place, then turned to face her, leaning against the desk with his arms crossed. I suppose you hate me, he finally said. I do not know you well enough to hate you, Grace said, but I certainly do not like you, and I do not like what you have done. Something that might have been surprise crossed Keith's face. Fair enough. For what it is worth, I do not much like myself for it either. Then why did you do it? Grace demanded. Why would you pay money for a person? Are there not women enough in Montana who would marry you willingly? Keith was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. I tried the normal way, courted a woman in town a few years back, Sarah Mitchell. We were engaged to be married. Then she met a silver miner passing through, decided he had better prospects, and left with him. He paused. After that, I just wanted someone here. Someone to share the work and the life. I am not looking for love or romance, Miss Jensen. I just wanted a partner, and your brother offered a solution. A solution, Grace repeated bitterly. Is that what you call it? You bought a slave. No, Keith said, and there was a sudden sharpness in his voice. I did not buy a slave. I paid off your brother's debts so he would leave you alone. He pushed away from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at his land. You are free to go if you want. Right now, I will not stop you. Grace stared at his back, confusion replacing some of her anger. What? Keith turned to face her again. You heard me. You are free to go. I thought about this for a long time before I agreed to meet with your brother. I knew what he was proposing was wrong, but I also knew that if I did not take you, he would just sell you to someone else, maybe someone who would not give you a choice. He walked back toward her slowly. So here is the choice, Grace Jensen. You can walk out that door right now and go wherever you want. I will not follow you or try to stop you. You are free from your brother forever. The money I gave him, that is done. He has no more claim on you. Grace's mind was reeling. This was not what she had expected. And if I stay? If you stay, it is because you choose to, Keith said. Not because I bought you, not because you owe me anything. You can work here, earn your keep. I will pay you wages same as I would any ranch hand. You can save up, leave when you want. Or if you decide you want to try to make this arrangement work as a proper marriage, we can talk about that. But it would be your decision, not mine forcing you. Grace looked around the room, then back at Keith Langford's face. He looked sincere, but she had been fooled by sincerity before. Still, what choice did she really have? She had no money, no place to go, no one to turn to. And if what he was saying was true, if she really was free from Daniel, that was worth something. I want it in writing, she said finally. That I am free to leave, that you will pay me wages, all of it. I want it written down and signed. Keith nodded slowly. That is fair. I can do that. He went back to the desk and pulled out paper and ink. I will write it now, and we can go into town tomorrow and have it witnessed by the marshal if you want. Grace watched as he bent over the paper, writing in a clear, careful hand. He was a man of contradictions, she thought. He had paid money for a bride, which was despicable, but he was also offering her freedom and fairness, which was more than most men would do. She did not know what to make of him. When he finished writing, he handed her the paper to read. It was exactly as he had said, stating clearly that Grace Jensen was free to leave the Langford ranch at any time, that she would be paid $20 a month for her work, and that any marriage arrangement would require her free and willing consent. At the bottom was a line for his signature and one for hers. $20 a month is more than fair, Grace said, surprised despite herself. Ranch hands usually make less. You will be doing more than a ranch hand, Keith said. Cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with the books if you can read and write well, and you deserve fair compensation. He took the paper back and signed it, then handed her the pen. Grace hesitated for just a moment, then signed her name next to his. Whatever this was, whatever strange arrangement she had just entered into, at least she had some protection now. Some guarantee that she was not completely at this man's mercy. There is a room upstairs, Keith said, taking the paper and folding it carefully before handing it back to her. "Second door on the right. It is yours. I will not enter it without your permission." He walked toward the front door. "I have work to do in the barn. There is food in the kitchen if you are hungry. Take the time you need to settle in." Then he was gone and Grace was alone in the house. She stood there for a long moment, clutching the paper in her hands, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her brother had sold her. A stranger had bought her. And then that same stranger had told her she was free. She climbed the stairs slowly, finding the room Keith had indicated. It was simple but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch. There was even a small mirror on the wall and a wash basin on the dresser. Grace sat on the bed and finally let herself cry. Great heaving sobs that came from deep inside her chest, mourning the loss of her family, her home, her sense of safety in the world. When the tears finally stopped, she washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red and puffy. Her dark blonde hair was a mess from the wagon ride, but she was still herself. Still Grace Jensen, and she would survive this like she had survived everything else life had thrown at her. She went downstairs and found the kitchen. It was well stocked, better than she had expected. She started a fire in the stove and began preparing a meal, needing something to do with her hands, something to focus on besides the chaos of her thoughts. By the time Keith came back inside as the sun was setting, she had made a simple but hearty stew and fresh biscuits. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, surprise evident on his face. "You did not have to do this." "I need to earn my keep," Grace said. "And I need to eat, so I might as well make enough for both of us." They ate in awkward silence at the kitchen table. Grace found herself stealing glances at Keith when she thought he was not looking. He ate neatly, methodically, and she noticed that his hands were calloused and scarred from years of hard work. There was something lonely about him, something that called to the lonely places in her own heart, but she pushed that thought away. She could not afford to feel sympathy for this man, could not afford to soften toward him. "Tell me about the ranch," she said finally, more to break the silence than anything else. "How long have you been here?" Keith looked up from his plate. 7 years. I came out from Missouri after the war. My father fought for the Union, and things were hard for us after it ended. I wanted a fresh start, somewhere I could build something of my own." He took a drink of water. "I started with nothing, worked as a ranch hand for other people, saved every penny. Finally had enough to buy this land and a small herd. It has been growing ever since." "That must have been difficult," Grace said, "building all of this alone." "It was," Keith admitted. "Still is sometimes. It is a lot of work for one person. I have a few hands who come during roundup and branding season, but most of the time it is just me." He paused. "That is part of why I agreed to your brother's proposal, I suppose. The work is endless, and the loneliness gets to you after a while." Grace found herself understanding that more than she wanted to admit. She had been lonely too, in that cabin with Daniel and his drinking and his anger. Lonely even before her parents died, because Daniel had never really been a brother to her in the way that counted. "I can read and write," she said, "and I can do figures. My mother taught me. I can help with the books if you need it." Keith's face softened slightly. "That would be helpful. I am not bad with numbers, but it takes time I would rather spend on other things." He studied her for a moment. "You do not have to prove yourself to me, you know. You do not owe me anything." "I know what the paper says," Grace replied, "but I will not be a burden. I will work for my wages." They finished the meal in silence, and Grace cleaned up while Keith went back outside to check on the animals one more time before full dark. When he came back in, he stood awkwardly in the main room, clearly unsure of what to do or say. "I usually read for a bit before bed," he said finally. You are welcome to join me, or you can go to your room if you prefer." Grace was exhausted, emotionally and physically, but she found herself curious about this strange man. "What do you read?" Keith walked to a small bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a worn volume. "Whatever I can get my hands on. Right now, it is Ivanhoe. I have read it before, but I do not have many books." "I like that one," Grace said softly. "My father used to read it aloud to us in the evenings." Something passed between them then, a small moment of connection over a shared love of stories. Keith handed her the book. "You can borrow it if you want, or any of the others." "Thank you," Grace said, taking the book and feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was such a small gesture, but it meant something to her in that moment, a sign that perhaps this situation was not completely hopeless. She went to her room and read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. When she finally slept, she dreamed of her parents and the way her mother had sung while cooking and her father had laughed at his own jokes. She woke once in the night, disoriented and frightened until she remembered where she was and why. Through the window, she could see stars spread across the Montana sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet, and she wondered what the future held for her in this strange new life. Morning came early on a ranch, and Grace woke to the sound of Keith moving around downstairs. She dressed quickly in the same clothes from yesterday, realizing that she had brought nothing with her, had no possessions except what she wore. The thought brought a fresh wave of anger at Daniel, but she pushed it down. He was gone, and she needed to focus on what came next. Keith was making coffee when she came into the kitchen, and he looked up a bit startled. "Morning. I hope I did not wake you." "I am used to early mornings," Grace said. "What needs to be done?" They fell into a routine over the next few days. Keith worked outside with the cattle and horses, repairing fences and tending to the endless tasks that came with running a ranch. Grace took over the house, cleaning and cooking and starting to organize things in a way that made more sense. She found that Keith had been living like a bachelor, with clothes piled in corners and dishes done haphazardly. It was clear he had been surviving rather than truly living. On the third day, Keith took her into town as he had promised, and they went to see Marshal Tom Baker. The marshal was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He read the paper Keith and Grace had signed, then looked at Grace carefully. "Is this what you want, Miss Jensen?" he asked. "You understand what you are signing here?" "I understand," Grace said firmly. "And yes, it is what I want." The marshal nodded and signed as a witness, then had his deputy sign as well. "Keith Langford is a good man," he said, "but you come to me if you have any trouble you hear. Woman should not be bought and sold like property, no matter what the circumstances." "She was not bought," Keith said quietly. "She was freed. There is a difference." "Maybe so," the marshal said, "but the rest of the town might not see it that way. You both need to be prepared for talk." He was right. As they walked through Wood River, Grace could feel eyes on them, could hear the whispers that followed in their wake. News traveled fast in small towns, and clearly the story of Daniel Jensen selling his sister had already made the rounds. Some of the looks were sympathetic, but others were judgmental or simply curious. "Ignore them," Keith said quietly as they walked to the general store. "People will always talk. It does not matter what they think." But it did matter, at least to Grace. She held her head high and met the stares directly, refusing to be ashamed of something that was not her fault. In the general store, Mrs. Patterson, the owner's wife, was more kind than curious. "What can I help you folks with today?" she asked, her voice warm. "Miss Jensen needs some things," Keith said. "Clothes, personal items, whatever she needs." "I can pay for my own things," Grace started to say, but Keith shook his head. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said. You cannot work in the same dress every day." Grace wanted to argue, but she also needed the clothes desperately. Mrs. Patterson took her to the back of the store where the ready-made dresses and women's items were kept, leaving Keith to look at tools and supplies. "How are you doing, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly once they were alone. "I heard what happened with your brother. Terrible thing." "I am managing," Grace said. "Mr. Langford has been fair to me." "Keith is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said, echoing the marshal's words. "Bit lonely and closed off since Sarah Mitchell broke his heart, but good. My husband says he is the most honest rancher in the county, always pays his debts on time, always treats his hired men fair." She pulled out a simple but pretty blue dress. "This would look lovely with your coloring." Grace selected 3 dresses, some undergarments, a nightgown, and a warm shawl. Mrs. Patterson threw in some soap and a hairbrush with a smile. "Every woman needs these," she said. "No charge for those." When Keith paid for everything, Grace made careful note of the amount, $23.50. She would pay him back from her wages, she determined. She would not be in debt to him or anyone else. They loaded the packages into the wagon and headed back to the ranch. Keith was quiet on the drive, his eyes on the road, and Grace found herself studying his profile. He was handsome, she realized with a start, in a way she had not really noticed before. Strong jaw, straight nose, a small scar on his left cheek that she wondered about. When he caught her looking, she quickly turned away, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "What is the scar from?" she asked, needing to say something to cover her embarrassment. Keith's hand went automatically to his cheek. "Ornery bull about 5 years back. Got between me and the fence when I was not paying attention. I was lucky he just grazed me instead of getting me with his horns properly." "Ranching is dangerous work," Grace said. "Living is dangerous work," Keith replied with a hint of dry humor. "At least on a ranch you can see most of the dangers coming." They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Grace realized that the tight knot of fear in her chest had started to ease somewhat. She still did not know what her future held, still did not know if she would stay at the Langford ranch or leave as soon as she had enough money saved, but at least she felt safe for the moment. Over the next few weeks, a routine established itself. Grace woke early and made breakfast while Keith did the morning feeding. They ate together, not saying much but growing comfortable with the silence. Then Keith would go out to work while Grace took care of the house. In the afternoons, he taught her about the ranch, showing her the cattle and horses, explaining how he tracked expenses and income, letting her help with the books. Grace discovered she had a head for the business side of ranching. She could see patterns in the numbers that Keith had missed, could suggest ways to save money or maximize profit. Keith listened to her ideas with respect, often implementing them, and Grace felt a pride in her work that she had never experienced before. One evening, about a month after she had arrived, they were sitting on the front porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Keith had taken to sitting out here each night, and Grace had started joining him, bringing her mending or simply enjoying the peace after a day of work. "I have been thinking," Keith said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what the marshal said about people talking." Grace's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "What about it? If it bothers you, we could tell people we are properly married," Keith said. "Not really, of course, not unless you wanted that, but just to stop the gossip." "Lying to people seems wrong," Grace said slowly. "And it would not be fair to you. What if you met someone you actually wanted to marry?" Keith was quiet for a long moment. "I do not think that is going to happen. After Sarah, I put that part of my life away. This arrangement we have, it works. You have a place to live and work that you choose to be at. I have help with the ranch and someone to talk to in the evenings. That is more than I expected to have." Grace looked at him, seeing the loneliness in his eyes, and felt an unexpected pang in her chest. "That is a sad way to live, Keith. You are young still. You should not give up on love just because one woman was foolish enough to leave you." "Maybe," Keith said, "but I am content with what I have. More than content, actually." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the fading light. "You have made this house feel like a home, Grace. I had forgotten what that felt like." Grace felt something shift inside her at his words, something she was not quite ready to examine too closely. "You have given me a chance to start over," she said softly. "That is worth more than you know." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, and Grace realized that she had not thought about leaving in over a week. That the anger she had felt toward Keith had faded into something else, something complicated and new. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch work intensified. Keith hired 2 hands for the season, young men named Tom and Pete who came from a homestead further south. They were respectful to Grace, tipping their hats and calling her Madam, and they treated Keith with obvious respect and liking. Grace fell into the rhythm of feeding 5 people instead of 2, packing lunches for the men to take out to the range, making sure there was always coffee hot on the stove. She started a vegetable garden behind the house, planting seeds that Mrs. Patterson had given her, and took pride in watching the green shoots push up through the soil. One particularly hot day in July, Keith came back to the house mid-morning, his face tight with worry. "One of the water sources has dried up," he said. "The cattle in the north pasture do not have enough water. We are going to have to move them." "How long will that take?" Grace asked. "All day, probably into the night," Keith said. "It is a lot of cattle to move." Grace made a quick decision. "I will come help." "You will need everyone you can get." "You do not know how to herd cattle," Keith said, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost hopeful. "Then you will teach me," Grace said firmly. "I can ride well enough. My father taught me when I was young." Keith hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you, understand? Cattle can be unpredictable." They saddled a gentle mare named Daisy for Grace, and she followed Keith and the 2 hired hands out to the north pasture. The work was hot, dusty, and exhausting. The cattle were reluctant to move in the heat, and it took patient, careful herding to get them going in the right direction. Grace found herself enjoying it despite the difficulty. There was something primal and satisfying about working with the animals, about being part of the land in such an immediate way. Keith stayed close to her, calling out instructions, and she could feel his approval when she did something right. By the time they got the cattle moved to a pasture with better water access, the sun was setting and Grace was so tired she could barely stay in the saddle. Keith rode up beside her, concern on his face. "You all right?" he asked. "I am fine," Grace said, though she was not sure she could feel her legs anymore. "Just tired." "You did good work today," Keith said, and the warmth in his voice made her look at him. "Real good work. Thank you." Something in the way he was looking at her made Grace's heart beat faster. She quickly looked away, confused by her own reaction. "We should get back," she said. That night, after a late dinner that Grace barely had energy to prepare, she collapsed into bed fully clothed and slept harder than she had in years. When she woke the next morning, her muscles screaming in protest, there was a note slipped under her door. "Take the day to rest. You earned it." Grace felt a smile tug at her lips. She did take the day a bit easier, though she still did her regular work. That evening, Keith came in early, which was unusual. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." He led her out past the corrals to a spot where the land rose slightly, giving a view of the ranch and the mountains beyond. The sun was just starting to set, painting everything in golden light. "This is my favorite spot," Keith said quietly. "When I first bought this land, I used to come up here and imagine what I could build, what it could become." He turned to look at her. "I just wanted to share it with you, to say thank you for yesterday, and for everything you have done since you came here." Grace looked out at the view, then at Keith's face, and felt something click into place inside her. She had been fighting it for weeks, maybe longer, but standing here in the golden light, she could not deny it anymore. She was falling in love with Keith Langford. The realization terrified her. She had promised herself she would not let her heart get involved, that this was just a practical arrangement. But Keith had been kind and respectful and fair, and somewhere along the way, he had become more than just the man who had paid off her brother. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "Thank you for showing me." Keith smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. They stood there together as the sun sank lower, not touching but somehow connected by the moment, and Grace wondered if Keith felt it too, this thing growing between them. August brought its own challenges. A summer storm damaged part of the barn roof, and Grace helped Keith and the hired hands with repairs, handing up shingles and holding the ladder steady. Her hands grew calloused from the work, her skin tanned from the sun, and she barely recognized herself when she looked in the mirror. She had grown stronger, both physically and in other ways. The fearful young woman who had arrived at the ranch had been replaced by someone more confident, someone who knew her own worth. Keith noticed the change too, she could tell, in the way he looked at her sometimes, as if seeing her fresh. One evening in late August, a rider came to the ranch just as they were finishing dinner. It was Marshal Baker, and the serious expression on his face made Grace's stomach clench with worry. "Evening, Keith, Miss Jensen," the marshal said, tipping his hat. "Sorry to bother you folks, but I thought you should know. Your brother is back in Wood River, Miss Jensen." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Daniel, why?" "He lost all that money Langford gave him," the marshal said. "Gambling debts again. He has been asking around about you, saying he wants to see you." "He has no right to see her," Keith said, his voice hard. "He gave up that right when he took my money." "That is how I see it too," Marshal Baker said. "But he is making noise about it not being a legal transaction, about you having to return his sister." He looked at Grace. "I told him that was nonsense, that you are a grown woman who can make her own choices, but he is drunk most of the time and not listening to reason." "I will not go back to him," Grace said firmly, though fear was making her hands shake. "I will not." "You do not have to," Keith said, moving closer to her. "You have the paper we signed. You are free. The marshal witnessed it himself." "Paper might not mean much to a drunk man with debts," the marshal said grimly. "I will keep an eye on him, but you folks should be careful. Lock your doors at night. And Keith, you might want to keep your rifle handy." After the marshal left, Keith checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. Grace tried to go about cleaning up from dinner, but her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped a plate. "Hey," Keith said gently, taking the plate from her and setting it down. "You are safe here. I will not let him take you." "What if he brings men with him?" Grace asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if he tries to force me to leave? Then I will stop him," Keith said simply. "I promise you, Grace, you are under my protection. As long as you want to be here, you will be here." Grace looked up at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, and felt something break open inside her. Before she could think about it, before she could stop herself, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. Keith went still for a moment, clearly surprised, but then his arms came around her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, Grace drawing comfort from his solid presence, Keith offering the shelter of his embrace without demanding anything in return. "I am sorry," Grace finally said, pulling back. "I should not have. Do not apologize," Keith said, his hand still resting lightly on her arms. "I am glad you felt you could turn to me." He paused, something vulnerable in his eyes. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I have been trying not to say it, trying not to complicate things, but I cannot keep it in anymore." Grace's heart was pounding. "What is it?" "I care about you," Keith said. "More than I should, probably. More than is wise given how this all started. But somewhere along the way you became important to me, not just as a housekeeper or a bookkeeper, but as a person, as a woman." He took a breath. "I think I am falling in love with you, Grace." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I tried not to. I told myself it was foolish, that I should just focus on earning my wages and planning my future. But you have been so good to me, Keith. So kind and fair and decent. How could I not fall in love with you?" Keith's face transformed with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "You mean it." "I mean it," Grace said. And then he was kissing her, his lips gentle but sure against hers, and Grace felt like she was coming home to a place she had not known she had been searching for. They pulled apart slowly, both breathing hard, and Keith rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, the way I should have from the beginning. I want you to choose me, not because I paid off your brother or because you feel obligated, but because you want to be with me." "I do want to be with you," Grace said. "But I understand what you are saying. We can take our time. We can do this properly." That night, Grace lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing with a mixture of joy and fear. She was in love with Keith Langford. She was in love, and he loved her back. But Daniel was in town, and she did not know what he might do in his desperation. The next few days passed tensely. Keith had the hired hands take turns keeping watch at night, and he made sure Grace was never alone on the property. He taught her how to shoot a rifle, taking her out to practice until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. "I hope you never have to use this," he said, "but I will feel better knowing you can defend yourself if needed." Grace hated the weight of the rifle in her hands, hated that she needed to learn such a thing, but she understood the necessity. Daniel had always been unpredictable, and desperation would only make him more dangerous. On the fourth day after the marshal's warning, Daniel came to the ranch. Grace was in the garden picking vegetables when she heard the horse approaching. She looked up and felt ice flood her veins when she saw her brother riding up the path, swaying slightly in the saddle. "Grace," he called out, his voice slurred. "Grace, I need to talk to you." Keith came out of the barn at a run, positioning himself between Daniel and Grace. The two hired hands appeared as well, flanking Keith. "You need to leave, Jensen," Keith said, his voice hard. "You have no business here." "She is my sister," Daniel said, climbing down from his horse with unsteady movements. "I have every right to see her." "You sold that right," Keith said, "and she does not want to see you." "Is that true, Grace?" Daniel called out, trying to see around Keith. "Have you forgotten you have a brother? Forgotten your own family?" Grace stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You stopped being my family when you sold me to pay your gambling debts," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I have nothing to say to you, Daniel. Leave." "I just need a bit of money," Daniel said, his voice turning wheedling. "Just $100 or so. You are living here in comfort, you must have money. Help your brother out." "The answer is no," Grace said. "You will not get another cent from me or from Keith. You made your choices. Now live with them." Daniel's face twisted with anger. "You ungrateful little," he lunged forward, but Keith caught him, spinning him around and pinning his arms. "That is enough," Keith said. Tom, Pete, help me escort Mr. Jensen off the property." Daniel struggled, cursing and shouting, but the three men were stronger and sober. They got him back on his horse and pointed him toward town. "If you come back here, I will have you arrested for trespassing," Keith said. "And if you ever try to hurt Grace again, you will answer to me. Do you understand?" Daniel just spat on the ground and rode off, weaving dangerously in the saddle. Grace felt her knees go weak with relief, and Keith was there immediately supporting her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am fine," Grace said. "Or I will be. Thank you for protecting me." "Always," Keith said. "I told you, you are safe here." Marshal Baker came by the next day to tell them that Daniel had been arrested for getting into a drunken brawl at the saloon. "He is going to be in jail for a while," the marshal said. "And when he gets out, I am going to strongly suggest he leaves Montana. I think he has finally figured out that no one here wants him around." "Good," Grace said with feeling, and neither man argued with her. With the threat of Daniel removed, Grace and Keith's relationship deepened. He courted her in small, sweet ways, bringing her wildflowers from the meadow, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings and talking about everything and nothing, teaching her to dance in the main room while Tom played fiddle. One evening in early September, as the summer heat was finally breaking, Keith took Grace back up to his favorite spot overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of reds and golds, and Keith took her hand in his. "Grace Jensen, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. "And I need you to know that you can say no and it will be all right. You will still have your place here, still have your wages and your freedom. Nothing I have promised you will change." Grace's heart was pounding. "What is it?" Keith dropped to one knee and Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. He pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket, the kind that must have cost him a good portion of his savings. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not because of any arrangement or obligation, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Will you be my wife?" "Yes," Grace said, the word coming out choked with emotion. "Yes, Keith, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he was standing, and she was in his arms, and they were kissing as the sun painted the world around them in gold. They were married in the small church in Wood River 2 weeks later. Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town helped Grace make a simple but pretty wedding dress, and Keith wore his Sunday best, his hair neatly trimmed and his face cleanly shaven. Tom and Pete stood up as witnesses, along with Marshal Baker and his wife. Grace walked down the aisle alone, needing no one to give her away, because she was giving herself freely. Keith's face when he saw her was worth everything she had been through to get to this moment. The minister kept the ceremony short and sweet, and when Keith kissed her as his wife, Grace felt like the whole world had righted itself. The wedding supper was held at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, and it seemed like half the town turned out to celebrate. People who had whispered and gossiped when Grace first arrived now congratulated them genuinely. And Grace realized that she and Keith had won them over through simple honesty and hard work. That night, in the bedroom that was now truly theirs to share, Keith held Grace close and whispered promises against her hair. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," he said. "I could never regret this," Grace said, kissing him. "You gave me my freedom, Keith. And then I chose to give you my heart. That is something precious." Their first year of marriage brought changes and challenges. The ranch continued to grow, and Keith was able to hire a permanent hand named George, an older man who had been ranching all his life and who became something of a mentor to Keith. Grace's garden flourished, providing vegetables for the table and even some to sell in town. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. Keith's joy was so pure and complete that it made Grace cry, and he spent the next months hovering over her, worried about every little thing until Grace finally had to tell him firmly that women had been having babies since the beginning of time and she would be fine. "I know," Keith said. "But you are my wife, and this is our child. I am allowed to worry." Grace went into labor on a hot day in early August, and Keith paced the downstairs while Mrs. Patterson and the doctor attended to Grace upstairs. The labor was long and difficult, and Keith could hear Grace's cries of pain. He wanted to go to her, but Mrs. Patterson had firmly told him to stay out of the way. Finally, after what felt like days but was actually only 12 hours, he heard a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Keith took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the bedroom to find Grace propped up on pillows, exhausted but smiling with a tiny bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," she said softly. "Keith, we have a son." Keith approached slowly, in awe of the tiny person his wife held. The baby had dark hair like his and Grace's nose, and when he opened his eyes they were dark blue. "He is perfect," Keith said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Grace." They named him Robert, after Grace's father, and from the moment he entered the world, Robert Langford was loved beyond measure. Keith was a devoted father, getting up with Grace for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching his son sleep. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Grace managed the house and the books while caring for Robert, and Keith managed the land and the cattle. They worked as partners in everything, making decisions together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good times. 2 years after Robert was born, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine. She had Grace's blonde hair and Keith's dark eyes, and she was as different from her brother as could be. Where Robert was serious and thoughtful, Catherine was all smiles and laughter. The ranch continued to prosper. Keith's reputation as an honest, fair rancher grew, and he was often asked to help settle disputes between neighbors or to give advice to younger ranchers just starting out. Grace became known for her skill with figures, and several other ranchers started coming to her for help with their books. On a cool evening in the fall of 1891, 10 years after that terrible day when Daniel had brought Grace to the ranch, Keith and Grace sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Robert, now 9, was teaching 7-year-old Catherine how to rope a fence post, and their laughter rang through the air. "You ever think about that first day?" Keith asked. "When your brother brought you here?" "Sometimes," Grace said, taking his hand, "but not with pain anymore. That day brought me to you, and I cannot regret that, even though the circumstances were terrible." "I used to feel guilty," Keith admitted, "for taking advantage of your situation, even though I tried to do right by you." "You did do right by me," Grace said firmly. "You gave me a choice, Keith. You gave me freedom and respect and time to figure out my own heart. That is more than most women get in this world." Keith raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You made me believe in love again," he said. "After Sarah, I thought I would spend my life alone. Then you came, and you were so fierce and brave and good. How could I not fall in love with you?" "We saved each other," Grace said. "That is what I think. You saved me from Daniel and a life of fear. I saved you from loneliness and bitterness. We made each other whole." As if sensing their parents' mood, Catherine came running up to the porch, her face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Papa, look what I can do." She threw her rope at the post, and while her aim was terrible, her enthusiasm more than made up for it. "That was wonderful, sweet girl," Grace said, laughing. "Keep practicing." Robert came up more slowly, his face thoughtful in a way that reminded Grace so much of Keith. "Papa, can you tell us about when you and Mama met?" he asked. Grace and Keith exchanged a glance. They had always been honest with their children, explaining in age-appropriate terms that Mama had been in a difficult situation and Papa had helped her, and that they had fallen in love. "Your Mama was the bravest person I had ever met," Keith said, pulling Catherine onto his lap and making room for Robert beside him. She had been through hard times, but she did not let those times make her hard. She stayed kind and strong and true to herself. "That is what made me fall in love with her. And your Papa gave me a chance to start over," Grace added. "He treated me with respect and gave me freedom to choose my own path. I chose him, and I have never once regretted that choice." "I am glad you chose Papa," Catherine said seriously. "Because then we got to be born." Everyone laughed at that simple, childish logic, but there was truth in it. Grace looked at her family, at the life they had built together, and felt a contentment so deep, it was almost overwhelming. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. Grace's garden grew to include an orchard, and her preserves became famous throughout the county. Keith expanded the ranch further, buying additional land and building a bigger barn. Robert grew into a serious, hard-working young man who loved the ranch life, while Catherine proved to have a talent for horses that rivaled her father's. In 1897, when Robert was 15 and Catherine was 13, Grace gave birth to another son, whom they named James. His arrival was a surprise, as Grace had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but he was welcomed with joy by the whole family. Marshall Baker retired that same year, and Keith was asked to take over as Marshal of Wood River. He declined, preferring to focus on his ranch and his family, but he did agree to serve as deputy marshal when needed. The respect and trust the community showed him filled Grace with pride. Daniel Jensen was never heard from again after he left Montana. Occasionally, someone would mention seeing a man matching his description in California or Colorado, but nothing was ever confirmed. Grace found that she had forgiven her brother, not for his sake but for her own. Carrying that anger and hurt had been a burden she was glad to put down. Mrs. Patterson became one of Grace's closest friends, often coming out to the ranch for tea and bringing news from town. When her husband died in 1900, Grace and Keith welcomed her to stay with them for several weeks, and the kindness was something Mrs. Patterson never forgot. The new century brought changes to Montana and to the Langford Ranch. Barbed wire fences replaced open range, and the days of the massive cattle drives were ending. Keith adapted to the changes, always looking for ways to improve and grow while still maintaining the values of hard work and fair dealing that had built his success. Robert married a sweet girl named Emma in 1903, and they built a house on the far edge of the ranch property. When their first child was born the following year, a daughter named Grace after her grandmother, Keith and Grace became grandparents for the first time. Grace held her tiny namesake and cried tears of joy, marveling at how life had brought her full circle. Catherine proved to be more independent, declining several marriage proposals because, as she said, she had not yet met anyone who could keep up with her. She became known as one of the best horse trainers in Montana, and men came from miles around to have her work with their animals. Grace supported her daughter's choice to remain unmarried, knowing that Catherine would find her path in her own time. Young James grew up with the ranch as his playground, loved and doted on by his older siblings and parents. He had Keith's way with animals and Grace's head for business, and it was clear that the ranch would be in good hands when Keith decided to step back. On a warm evening in June 1905, Keith and Grace celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary with a party that drew people from all over the county. The ranch was full of life and laughter, with children running everywhere and tables laden with food. As Grace looked around at all the people who had become part of their lives, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Keith and Grace walked up to their special spot overlooking the ranch. The moon was full, painting everything in silver light. 24 years, Keith said, putting his arm around Grace's shoulders. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you arrived here. I was so scared that day, Grace remembered. So angry and scared and lost. I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning, Keith said. We both got a second chance, Grace, a chance to build something real and good and lasting. Grace leaned into her husband's solid warmth, looking out at the ranch they had built together. The house that had once seemed so empty now overflowed with love and life. The land that Keith had worked alone for so many years now supported a family, a legacy. You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not paid off Daniel that day? Grace asked. If you had just let him take me to someone else? I try not to think about it, Keith said seriously, because I cannot imagine my life without you. You are everything to me, Grace. You and our children and the life we have built. That day, I thought I was just helping someone in need. I did not know I was bringing home my other half. Grace turned in his arms to face him. In the moonlight, she could see the lines that age and weather had etched into his face, the gray that was starting to show in his dark hair. But she could also see the same kind eyes, the same strong character that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. I love you, she said simply. Thank you for giving me my freedom, and thank you for making me want to give it back to you freely and completely. Keith kissed her then, a kiss that held 24 years of love and partnership and shared joy and sorrow. When they pulled apart, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the land that was theirs, the life they had made. The years continued on as years do. Robert and Emma had 4 more children, filling the ranch with grandchildren for Keith and Grace to spoil. Catherine eventually married a schoolteacher from Helena, a quiet man who adored her spirit and supported her dreams, and they settled in Wood River, where Catherine could continue her horse training. James took over more and more of the day-to-day running of the ranch as Keith grew older, though Keith never fully retired. He was the kind of man who needed to work, needed to be useful, and James respected that, always making sure his father felt valued and needed. Grace continued to manage the books until her eyes started failing in her 60s, at which point she taught James everything she knew, passing on her knowledge and skill. She took up other pursuits, particularly needlework, and her quilts became treasured family heirlooms. Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1912, and Grace mourned her friend deeply. But she took comfort in the fact that Mrs. Patterson had lived a long, full life and had been surrounded by people who loved her at the end. The world changed around them. Automobiles started appearing on the roads, replacing horses and wagons. The telephone lines reached Wood River, connecting them to the wider world. But the Langford Ranch remained a constant, a place of stability and love in a rapidly changing world. On a crisp autumn day in 1915, Keith and Grace celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Keith was 71 now, his hair gone completely gray, his movements slower but still strong. Grace was 64, her blonde hair white and her face lined but still beautiful to Keith's eyes. They sat together on the porch as the celebration went on around them, holding hands and watching their family with contentment. Robert was teaching his oldest son how to rope, just as he had once learned from his father. Catherine was showing her daughter how to gentle a young horse, passing on her skills to the next generation. James was deep in conversation with his uncle about expanding the ranch further east. "Look at what we made," Keith said softly, gesturing at the scene before them. "All of this from that one terrible day." "Not terrible," Grace corrected gently. "Hard, yes, frightening, yes, but not terrible because it brought me to you." She squeezed his hand. "Everything I went through before that day, all the fear and pain, it was worth it to end up here with you." "I never imagined I could be this happy," Keith said. "After Sarah left, after I bought this land, I thought I would always be alone. I had resigned myself to it. Then you arrived and you changed everything." "We changed everything together," Grace said. "That is what partnership means. That is what love means." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold just as it had on that evening so many years ago when Keith had first told Grace he loved her, their grandchildren came running up to the porch, clamoring for stories. "Tell us how you and Grandma met," one of them begged, and Keith and Grace exchanged a smile. They told the story as they had many times before, but they never tired of it. They told how Grace had arrived at the ranch in difficult circumstances, how Keith had given her a choice and freedom, how they had fallen in love slowly and surely. They did not hide the hard parts, the fact that Grace's brother had tried to sell her, but they also emphasized the good parts, the way respect and kindness had transformed a terrible situation into something beautiful. The children listened with wide eyes, as they always did, marveling at the idea of their proper grandparents having such an adventurous beginning. And when the story was done, Catherine's daughter asked the question she always asked. "But Grandma, how did you know Grandpa was the right one?" Grace looked at Keith, seeing the man she had loved for more than 30 years, the man who had given her freedom and then won her heart. "I knew he was the right one because he never tried to cage me," she said. "He gave me wings and then chose to fly beside me. That is how you know, sweet girl. When someone makes you more of yourself, not less." Keith raised Grace's hand to his lips and kissed it gently, just as he had done countless times before. In his eyes, Grace could see all the love and devotion that had sustained them through the years, through hardships and triumphs, through the simple daily living that made up a life. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Keith and Grace stood on their porch one more time, looking out at the ranch that had been built on courage and love and second chances. "No regrets?" Keith asked, as he sometimes did. "Not a single one," Grace answered, as she always did. And it was true. From that terrible day when she had been sold by her brother to this perfect moment surrounded by love and family, Grace Jensen Langford had built a life beyond anything she could have imagined. Keith had given her freedom when he said, "You're free from him forever." But she had given him something just as precious in return, her heart, freely chosen and freely given. The ranch would go on after they were gone, passed down through their children and their children's children, a legacy of love that had started with one man's kindness and one woman's courage. But more than the land or the cattle or the buildings, their true legacy was the family they had created, the love they had shared, and the example they had set of what it meant to choose each other every single day. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Keith and Grace went inside together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held, just as they had faced everything else. Together. The seasons turned as they always did, bringing spring rains and summer heat, autumn colors and winter snows. Keith and Grace grew older, their movements slower, their hair whiter, but their love for each other never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by years of shared experience and mutual respect. They spent their final years in quiet contentment, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built. Keith never lost his love for the land, often sitting on the porch and simply looking out at the ranch with satisfaction. Grace never lost her love for organization and order, still consulting on the books even when James had taken over completely, offering advice and wisdom gained from decades of experience. When Keith Langford finally passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1919 at the age of 75, Grace mourned deeply, but without bitterness. She had been blessed with 38 years of marriage to a good man, a kind man, a man who had given her freedom and then won her love. She had no regrets, only gratitude for the time they had been given. Grace lived for 3 more years, watching her grandchildren grow and even meeting several great-grandchildren before she died quietly in the house Keith had built, in the room they had shared for so many years. Her last words were about Keith, about seeing him again, about being ready to rest. They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, the same spot where Keith had first told Grace he loved her, the place they had gone so many times over the years to watch the sunset and talk about their lives. Their graves were simple, marked with stones that bore their names and dates and the words "Together Forever." The Langford Ranch continued on, passed down through the generations just as Keith and Grace had hoped. Each generation heard the story of how it all began, how Grace had arrived at the ranch in terrible circumstances, and how Keith had given her the freedom to choose her own path. How that freedom had led to love, and that love had built something lasting and good. And so, from a day of desperation and fear grew a legacy of love that lasted through the generations, a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of choice, and the transformative nature of true love. Keith and Grace's story became part of family legend, told and retold, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is hope, and that sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the greatest joys. The ranch remained in the family for generations, each new owner walking the land that Keith had worked and Grace had loved, standing in the house where their love story had unfolded, and understanding that they were part of something special, something precious, something built on the foundation of 2 people who had chosen each other freely and loved each other completely until the very end.